Neoliberalism used policies like fiscal austerity, financial deregulation, free trade, and the privatization of public assets in order to shrink the size and reach of government as a whole. But while neoliberalism has had some success in other countries, Brazil is not one of them. In fact, neoliberal policies caused massive, debilitating inflation when implemented in the 1990s. By 2015, the majority state-owned oil company Petrobras was mired in a scandal so big it's called the largest corruption scandal in Brazilian history. In the end, then President Dilma Rousseff was impeached and removed from office in 2016. Since then, many have wondered what direction the Latin American country would take. And with the election of what many are describing as a far-right nationalist, Jair Bolsonaro, to the presidency, many wonder if a swing in the opposite direction is the answer. Voter and Brazilian citizen Carlos Alberto da Silva told The Atlantic, quote, "I don't think he's great, but I want to see if he can change things. Because we have to do something about security and about education and the economy. If he tries to install a dictatorship, the Senate and everyone else would stop him, right?"
And the state-mandated BBC monitoring unit here in Britain tweeted or posed a question. Could Bolsonaro be a refreshing break from political correctness? It had to take the tweet down. What's your perspective on posing a question like that?
Well, the question is offensive, and it's actually obscene. And it's both offensive and obscene because Bolsonaro represents a break that has absolutely nothing refreshing about it. He represents a break not just from political correctness, he represents a break from democratic values, from the rule of law, from human rights, and from the core value of human dignity.
Is he dangerous to democracy in Brazil from what you've seen and what you've studied down there?
Well, Tyrell, I believe he is. I believe he's a threat to democracy in the entire region. He's been very open about the fact that he supported the 1964 coup d'etat, which was a military coup against a democratically elected president. I actually described this in my book. The U.S. was very much behind that coup.
He has supported torture. He has called for the mass elimination of political opponents. He has called for people to be killed. Thousands, he said, thousands more should have been killed during the dictatorship in Brazil. And again, these are not merely outlandish comments in a vacuum. They're comments from someone who lived through the Brazilian dictatorship, who knows what it means, and to a public in Brazil that is very much aware of what it means to propose torture, to support torture, and to support military dictatorship and summary executions.
But it wasn't only the BBC. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, funded by the Trudeau government, said that Brazil's new president-elect is a right-winger who leans towards more open markets. This could mean fresh opportunities for Canadian companies.
Equally problematic. But if we look in historical perspective, what you'll see, unfortunately, are alliances between right of center or extreme right and authoritarian political groups and big business. Right-wing groups in Latin America have facilitated the work of extractive industries. They've facilitated the work of large investments because they've been able to quiet dissent, often through extreme brutality. So this is not new. This is not acceptable to get in bed with someone who wants to kill, torture, eliminate rights, and undermine democracy.
In fact, it has to be pointed out that while Bolsonaro was democratically elected, in terms of the vote right now, that there were two preconditions to his even being, in the ballpark to run, and that was the impeachment of President Dilma and the jailing of former President Lula da Silva. Both of those were, many of us believe, were improper, amounted to soft coups that were supported very directly by the United States, by the way. And had Lula da Silva not been in jail, had he been able to run for office, he would have won with about 80% of the vote. And so this was really a coup by the right wing. And they are now in control of the government in Brazil. and I think are very open about the fact they're willing to use the military to exert their will in that country.
Authoritarian regimes in Latin America in the relatively recent past have implemented measures that include death squads, institutionalized torture, forced disappearance. What we're talking about is a state of near constant fear in which anybody can go missing, can be seized, ripped from his or her home, subjected to hours and days and weeks of brutal torture, murdered, or alternatively incarcerated with no legitimate basis in horrendous conditions, in dungeon-like conditions for years on end. So we know in Latin America what authoritarian rule means. We know what a nod and a wink to we need to be tough on crime, crack down, and eliminate opponents means. It means eliminate them. It means behead them. It means torture them. It means rape them. It means keep pregnant women until they give birth and then murdering the women and giving the baby away to others. All of this is recent Latin American past. This is not hypothetical. This is really frightening and terrible potentialities that we have to address and we have to respond to.
I think it's important to note that they do see a system that's broken. Ironically, though, it's the right wing that's now in power that broke it by their attacks against Dilma and Lula da Silva. And it's strange that they were rewarded for that by this vote. But yeah, I do think that there's going to be a lot of buyer's remorse amongst the voting population, and you're going to see that very quickly.
I hope that Western democratic states would use their leverage to constrain and limit potential abuses by Bolsonaro and his government. That's what I hope. Unfortunately, we have a long history in the UK, in the US, and elsewhere of support for authoritarian regimes, and support which tragically is driven by the business interests and the financial interests of large multinational corporations based in the UK and the United States.
Under the presidency of Lula da Silva, Brazil actually did a very good job of combating inequality, combating poverty. It did make inroads into combating crime, did a lot to protect the environment. So actually, there was a lot of progress towards what people wanted under Lula's terms in office. And in fact, Time magazine several years ago ranked Lula da Silva as the most influential leader in the world. He is now sitting in jail illegally. In fact, Noam Chomsky just went to visit him a few weeks ago. So again, I think that context just has to be out there, and people have to realize that, in fact, Brazilians' goals were being met under Lula, and he now rots in jail. And there's been almost no protest in the Western media or by Western governments about that fact, about this very popular leader sitting in jail as a fascist comes to power in Brazil.
We have great reason to fear that the United States will support Bolsonaro. I understand that Trump has already called to congratulate him. I think Trump sees Bolsonaro as someone who has been lifted by Trump's ascendance, sort of part of the global extreme right neo-nationalist movement. So there is some indication that there will be support. That said, both in the United States and in the UK and also in Western Europe, there are laws and procedures and limits on the ability to support rights abusers in other countries. My fear is most of the United States, then maybe the UK.